Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Madam Speaker, I'm proud to rise on behalf of the fiscally responsible citizens of Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke. This costly coalition is out of control. The fall economic statement spells out in black and white just how bad this government's addiction to spending has gotten. None of this is a surprise. It's déjà vu all over again. In 1972, after just one term under Pierre Trudeau, Canadians clipped his wings and handed him a minority government. Pierre Trudeau struck a deal with the NDP to stay in power. Sound familiar? The NDP made expensive demands, and the Liberals spent and spent and spent. They timed their spending for maximum pain as the rest of the decade was dominated by stagflation. High inflation and low growth fueled by government spending. Sound familiar? By the end of Pierre Trudeau's reign of error, the deficit was the largest in pre-pandemic Canadian history. The situation was so bad, Canadians had to elect a progressive Conservative government to raise taxes and the Liberal government to cut spending. It took 15 years to clean up Pierre Trudeau's overspending addiction. How long will Canadians have to wait this time? This fall economic statement is the height of delusion, or the peak of cynicism. Canadians face a stark choice. Either the government is delusional and believes spending even more than what it had been budgeted for only 6 months ago is fiscally responsible, or Canadians have a government that's so cynical of democracy it thinks it can just repeat the claim of fiscal responsibility enough that people believe them. This government knows it's addicted to spending without a plan. The Parliamentary Budget Officer says there is $14 billion unaccounted for. Just another little slush fund to pay off whichever interest group is most in favor tomorrow. Recently, headlines said the Bank of Canada lost money for the first time in history. And that's because they had to pay interest on the banks for the bonds they swapped to keep this government afloat. That's great for Bay Street, but it's bad for the taxpayers. Add that to the interest we're all paying on the debt. It's now more than what we spend on national defense, and soon it'll be more than we spend on health. It didn't have to be this way. Once upon a time, we had a national consensus that deficits outside of economic downturns were to be avoided. The economy roared back after the government lockdowns nearly cratered it. Had this government demonstrated even a modicum of self-restraint, we could be arguing about how to spend a surplus. Many Canadians believe that our country is becoming more polarized. We should ask ourselves if deficits contribute to the increasing polarization. Running deficits is a bit like musical chairs. Everyone knows eventually the song will end and there won't be enough chairs for every person, so people get their elbows up. And eventually the bonds stop selling and the money runs out. Rather than people scrambling for chairs, it'll be social factions fighting for funding. When the money runs out, do you close the school or the hospital? If this government truly wished to reduce polarization in society, they'd be running surpluses. When you run surpluses, everything becomes easier. It's like a game of musical chairs, except when the music stops, you add extra seats. With surpluses, you could pay down debt, lower taxes, and make sound investments in core areas of federal responsibility. All it requires is an element of patience. It requires the ability to say, not yet, to favored interest groups. But this government lacks discipline. This government lives in denial. Every budget, every update, they make the same empty promise. This time it'll be different, they say. It's as if Canadians are Charlie Brown and the Liberals are Lucy with a football of fiscal responsibility. In 2019, the budget said they'd be spending $421 billion by 2024. In 2020's economic update, the minister claimed spending in 2024 would be $429 billion. 1 year later, and they need to revise the numbers again. This time, they said the spending in 2024 would be $465 billion. That was just 12 months ago. Now, the gang who can't spend responsibly claims spending in 2024 will be $505 billion. That's not sustainable. There is no better illustration of this government's addiction to spending than its latest plans for the Canada Growth Fund. And here's what the fall economic statement says about the new Canada Growth Fund. The fund will make investments, quote, that contribute to economic growth through direct investments, loans, loan guarantees, and equity investments, end quote. Oh, apologies, Madam Speaker. That was the 2016 budget referring to the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Here's the quote from this year, quote, it'll invest using a broad suite of financial instruments, including all forms of debt, equity, guarantees, and specialized contracts, end quote. How will this growth fund operate? Here's what the government said, quote, the Canada Infrastructure Bank will be accountable to and partner with government, but will operate at a greater arm's length than a department, end quote. Sorry, that's the 2016 budget again. Here's the 22 budget. The Canada, quote, the Canada Growth Fund will be a new public investment vehicle that will operate at arm's length from the federal government, end quote. Now the Growth Fund is all about leveraging capital, private capital. Quote, it'll invest on a concessionary basis with the goal that for every dollar invested by the fund, it will aim to attract at least $3 of private capital, end quote. I will say the government has gotten slightly more modest since 2016. Quote, great opportunity for the government to leverage its investments in infrastructure by bringing private capital to the table to multiply the level of investment. There's potential to multiply this level of investment 10 to 14 times, end quote. While the Infrastructure Bank was supposed to be at arm's length and focused on infrastructure, it quickly fell victim to this government's radical net zero ideology. This so-called growth fund is just another example. The growth fund will be stuffed with well-connected executives friendly to the liberal ideology. They'll be paid bonuses whether they accomplish anything or not. Billions and billions for green dreams, yet Canada doesn't have a national four-lane highway. Ontario's Ring of Fire is full of critical minerals and metals, yet it's nearly inaccessible by road. This government has mandated that 20% of cars sold in 3 years will be zero emission. Yet they haven't even studied the costs of electric vehicles. There's nowhere near the electrical capacity in our grid to switch 1 in 5 cars. No amount of government spending can change the physics of energy density. No amount of growth funds or infrastructure banks can change the economic realities of scarcity and opportunity cost. With every dollar this government spends chasing its net zero ideology, it's a dollar we don't spend on mitigation. Every dollar this government borrows to purchase prohibited firearms is a dollar plus interest it cannot spend stopping gang violence. Every bonus paid to executives at the Infrastructure Bank or the Growth Fund comes at the expense of seniors, veterans, and the disabled.
Apologize, I have to interrupt the honourable member, but it is extremely noisy outside and inside the chamber. So I would appreciate it if we could look at it, please. Thank you. The honourable member.
We know the Minister of Justice has some disgusting suggestions on how we can cut spending on vulnerable Canadians. The Liberal addiction to spending is terrible. And sadly, bad spending is not the only terrible thing in Bill C-32. Reminding Canadians this bunch of Liberals is more like a parody of government. This bill attacks the solicitor-client privilege by requiring lawyers to report the names of their clients to the Canada Revenue Agency. The same government invoking solicitor-client privilege to keep its legal opinion hidden is removing that same privilege from Canadians. Finally, I think Canadians should know without any doubts this government wants to go down in history for bringing the biggest tax hike on alcohol in Canadian history. They could have introduced a freeze on the excise tax hikes, which they tied to inflation with their automatic escalator tax. Bill C-32 contains a number of changes to the excise tax. Of course, as with everything this government does, the changes are for the benefit of the government. They have no problem making it easier for the taxman to search your records, but make it easier for Canadians to enjoy a beer on the weekend? Forget it. All this government cares about are the wealthy and the well-connected who get rich off the special deals cooked up by these so-called arm's-length funds. Canadians need relief from inflation, and all this government does is increase spending, fueling inflation. Like an addict, this government will deny it has a problem. It will deny, deflect, until the money runs out.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I heard the member say that there's nowhere near enough charging capacity for electric vehicles. Well, I'd encourage her, I realize we're both from Ontario, to go travel a little east into Quebec, and she'll see that there is more than enough. Quebec actually has done an incredible job of building up its infrastructure. Ontario had that opportunity, but suddenly abandoned it 5 years ago when Doug Ford was elected. The reality of the situation is, Madam Speaker, it's about political will, and the Conservatives, at least provincially in Ontario, don't have the political will. What we've seen in Quebec is the exact opposite, and I'm wondering if the member would like to comment on that.
Member for Renfrew Nipissing Pembroke for 50 seconds.
That's pretty rich coming from a member of the Liberal government who is able to charge up that work every day and charge it to the taxpayers of Canada.
The Honourable Member will have 4 minutes of questions left after oral questions. Statements by members. Déclaration des députés.
Statements by members. The Honourable Member for Richmond Arthabaska. Madam Speaker, today I would like to take a moment to mark the 50th anniversary of the Quebec Association for the Advancement of the United Nations with respect to sustainable development in Haiti, which is called CANU. This non-governmental, volunteer-based organization aims to promote the values of the UN and human rights and carry out awareness-raising information and advocacy activities in favor of sustainable development, as well as supporting sustainable development projects in Haiti. This organization works with farmers groups to support food security, agriculture, and education to improve the situation in Haiti. Already over $7 million have been invested in more than 270 projects, in addition to outreach sessions in Haiti. And this organization also maintains close relations between the people there and here in Canada and Quebec. I would like to sincerely congratulate and thank all of the caring people involved in this organization who have been making a real difference in the lives of thousands of Haitians for 50 years now. The Honourable Member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in this House to pay tribute to one of the pillars of our community in Vaudreuil-Soulanges. On December 31st, Danielle Boyer, Director of the Saint-Lazare Public Safety and Fire Department, will retire after 30 years of loyal service. Since 1992, Mr. Boyer has risen through the ranks from firefighter to lieutenant to assistant director and finally to director since 2006. It is thanks to rare and precious qualities such as leadership, professionalism, and benevolence that he was able to gain the respect and love of his team at the fire station throughout these years.
Happy to hear you bought a motorcycle, and I hope you use it to explore not only our community, but our entire country. As your Member of Parliament, I can't think of a better way to spend your golden years, and I wish you safe and happy travels along the way. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
I've done nothing wrong, he said with a sneer. But Canadians are worried because Christmas is near. Christmas without food, Christmas without meat, Christmas without toys, and without any heat. The Grinch hates people who don't listen to that guy. We've tried to figure it out, but no one knows why. It could be perhaps that his socks were too tight. We suspect it's because his head isn't screwed on just right. His fingers in your pockets grabbing with glee, and now he wants the presents from under your tree. He's taxed all our taxes and spent even more. Our cupboards are emptier than ever before. Conservatives have tried, but he won't listen to reason. He loves his carbon tax, no matter what the season.
That's right.
But despite his cold heart and his love of inflation, Calgary Midnapore will never let him ruin our Christmas celebration.
L'honorable.
The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The holiday season is already upon us. It's a time of hot chocolate family gatherings and, yes, flannel pajamas. We can feel the excitement in Hochelaga. Community organizations have been working hard for months to make this time of year a magical one for everyone, or simply to ensure that everyone can enjoy a good meal or a full fridge for the holiday season. We know that during these tough times, these people will be here. I'd like to thank the organizations that have given their time and to help their fellow man during this International Volunteer Day. I would like to thank all those who help out in their community, whether it's a listening ear or a friendly smile. Thank you for your efforts. Accès Bénévolat is a Montreal East End organization that's been connecting hundreds of volunteers with over 300 social service organizations since 1982. A big thank you to all our organizations and the people that have been involved with them. Thank you very much. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, I will shortly be handing over to the Minister of Employment the demands of local organizations fighting for a better EI system. 2 weeks ago in Saguenay, there was a working group with women who demonstrated in front of my office to denounce not only the inhumane delays at Service Canada, but also the sexist nature of this benefit system. And I was able to see for myself what a constituent of mine was denied last year. She was denied EI after losing her job when she was on mat leave. The Social Security Tribunal ruled that a similar situation was discriminatory last January, but the government decided to appeal the case. What hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker, from a government that claims to be feminist and always there for vulnerable people. It's high time to reform the employment insurance system and make it fairer and effective. When will this reform take place? The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Mr. Speaker, when I was young during my studies at university in Chicoutimi, I had the chance to live in this magnificent region for a few years. I shared with my friends their love for nature and hunting. And this allowed me to savor the famous tourtière from Lac Saint-Jean, made with 7 kinds of wild meat. Today, as a member for a riding where hunting is also a popular activity, I would like to express my full appreciation for the hunters of Lac Saint-Jean, who practice this sport responsibly. There are hunting associations and shooting clubs in Quebec who have worked with police forces, community groups, and all levels of governments to improve this practice and make it safer. Real hunters do not need military-style weapons to practice their sport. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, December 5th is International Volunteer Day, and on this occasion, I would also like to take the opportunity to highlight the exceptional commitment of people in my riding of Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Since I was elected in 2015, I've had the opportunity to work with a large number of dedicated people who do not hesitate to give their time to help others. These volunteers often work behind the scenes, without counting their hours, without demanding any recognition, with the sole aim of doing good. So today I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight the invisible but absolutely essential and aspiring work of volunteers in our constituency and in the constituencies of all my colleagues. You are rare and precious, an invaluable treasure that helps make a positive difference in our communities. Your actions are important. Thank you for your tremendous contribution and for giving of yourself. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Hall-Elmer.
Your time for celebration and good cheer. But as 2022 comes to an end, let's be frank. We're all on edge. It's not hard to figure out why. Isolation due to working from home, unsettling vulnerability to a virus we can't see, yet whose harmful, sometimes fatal effects are cruelly felt. Add social media algorithms that distort any sense of vulnerability, of balance, ominous signs of climate change, wars, and conflicts around the world. You're right to feel edgy, anxious, vulnerable, alone. Me too. So what are we to do? Je choisis de puiser.
I choose to tap into these feelings of unease to fight for a better future. Don't give oxygen to extremism, violence, or hate. Join your neighbors to make positive change. And above all, be kind to each other and to yourself. We are tougher together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Mr. Speaker, I was born in Thunder Bay, and some of my fondest memories is the time spent with my dad and my two brothers walking through the bush on a beautiful fall day, and I'm proud to say I'm a hunter.
Here, here.
I wouldn't trade those memories for anything, Mr. Speaker, and I wouldn't want to deny anybody else the opportunity to make them. And Mr. Speaker, this is in no way inconsistent with the legislation before this House that will keep our streets and communities safe from unlawful gun and gang activity. Hunting is one of the oldest traditions in Canada, a tradition which involves and promotes the safe use of firearms. Hunting also provides food security to many Canadian families and Indigenous communities. A safe and sustainable practice of hunting in Canada not only respects our past, but recognizes its importance to Indigenous Canadians for whom it is a way of life. Mr. Speaker, I am committed to making sure we find the right balance. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dauphin, Swan River, Neepawa.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government has launched the largest attack on law-abiding hunters in Canadian history. This government's proposed amendments in Bill C-21 will effectively ban hundreds of thousands of firearms used for hunting. Hunting is a Canadian tradition. It is a way of life for millions of rural, remote, and Indigenous Canadians. But this Liberal government has attacked these Canadians ever since they took office. Their own minister, who is supposed to stand up for rural Canada, is in favour of this attack on hunters. That's no way to stand up for rural Canada. Yesterday, deer hunting season closed for most of hunters in Manitoba. Unfortunately, these hunters don't know if they'll be using their hunting rifles next year. So my message for this out-of-touch Liberal government: hunters are not the problem, so just leave them alone.
The honourable member for Brampton South.
Mr. Speaker, today marks day 11 of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Preventing and responding to gender-based violence is essential, and we all have a role to play. At the Safe Centre Appeal in Brampton, 16 partner organizations work together under one roof to provide integrated service delivery for survivors. The family justice model has been identified as an innovative practice and can be showcased nationally. I want to recognize Director Shanilina Jeshani and Peel Regional Police Inspector Lisa Hewson, as well as local organizations such as Zonta Club for their leadership. Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to action with our National Action Plan to end gender-based violence. This way, we make the vision of ending gender-based violence a reality for Canadians, no matter who they are, where they live. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cypress Hills, Grasslands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this past weekend we lost one of the good ones. Red Schellenberg was a family man, a person of faith, integrity, and a leader in Canadian agriculture. He led not only with his words, but also with his actions. He spent many years giving his time on different boards and associations. I know that many of us in Parliament here have met with Reg over the years, particularly in his most recent capacity as the president of the Canadian Cattle Association. He could always be counted on for honest, straightforward advice that was forged through his time on the Perrin Ranch south of Beachy with his wife Shannon by his side. Their story is one of living the Saskatchewan dream, running a multi-generational cow-calf operation on the northern shores of the beautiful Lake Diefenbaker. Reg will be sorely missed, and to Shannon, Jesse, Coy, and Stacy, our hearts and our prayers are with you and your families as you go through this difficult time of mourning.
The honourable member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Canadians are barely hanging on. The stress of paying for groceries is unbearable for many, especially those on fixed incomes. And today's announcements from Canada's 2023 Food Price Report sheds an even dimmer light on what's to come. According to the report, a family of 4 will spend $16,000 on groceries next year. That's an increase of $1,100. Last year's report projected food prices to rise by 7%, and this was considered alarmist by critics. The reality is today's report shows food prices have increased by 10%. The leader of the official opposition, alongside Conservatives, predicted this inflation and cost of living crisis years ago. The Liberals choose not to listen. They're doubled down on their imposing their fertilizer tax, carbon tax, and reliance on dictator oil. All these decisions are driving up the cost of food. By 2030, a typical 5,000-acre farm could expect to pay $150,000 in carbon tax. If farmers can't afford to run their farms, how can they afford to feed Canadians?
The honourable member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Mr. Speaker, I am delighted to rise today to celebrate the 36th Speaker of the House of Commons and my dear friend, the Honourable Jeff Regan. Serving more than 20 years as a Member of Parliament for Halifax West, the former Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, the first Speaker from Nova Scotia in 98 years, a teller of dad jokes, a karaoke superstar, a compassionate, smart human being, and very funny. Jeff Regan has left a spectacular legacy of public service here in this place and at home. As the selected decisions of Speaker Jeff Regan are tabled today, we fondly remember how he would use his clever and fair parenting skills here in the chamber to bring back decorum to even the most heated debates. Speaker Regan took this role seriously and always knew that one of his, and I quote, most important responsibilities as Speaker is to safeguard the rights and privileges of members individually and collectively. Mr. Speaker, we all know that this place is better because he shared his wisdom, his compassion for others, and his thoughtful words with us and with Canadians. Thank you for everything, Speaker Regan.
The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Mr. Speaker, something remarkable happened a few weeks ago. After campaigning vigorously on the need for dental care in the last election, New Democrats delivered. We forced the Liberal government, which had voted against the program only last year, to do an about-face and realize the benefits it will bring to millions of Canadians who can't afford to see a dentist. That program is now open for applications. And we're not finished there. Next year, the program will be expanded to include seniors, persons with disabilities, and children under the age of 18. Hear, hear. Conservative MPs voted against this. They did so even with the knowledge that they and their families will continue to benefit from taxpayer-funded dental care available to them as members of Parliament. A classic example of good for me, but not for thee. But I've got great news for people living in Conservative ridings. Even though your MP voted to deny you this care, New Democrats have your back, and we made sure it will be there for you and your kids. Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Désilets, Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I have the immense pleasure of marking the 75th anniversary of the St. Therese Legion. The St. Therese Legion, founded in 1947, is the 208th branch to open in Quebec. The St. Therese Legion is 75 years of support to veterans and their communities, 75 years of service to the community, 75 years of remembrance, 75 years of caring for the living without forgetting the dead. And also some good news for the Legion. After many steps taken with the Department of National Defence, the Legion will now be able to count on the 4th Battalion of the 22nd Regiment, stationed in Laval, to perform 21 rounds of service during the next Remembrance Day ceremonies. It's an honor for me to be a member of this dynamic and tightly knit Legion. I cannot stress enough how important it is to support our Legions, to take care of those who take care of our veterans. Happy 75th. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Sturgeon River Parkland.
Mr. Speaker, crime in Canada is on the rise. Since these Liberals took office, violent crime has risen by 32%, and gang-related homicides have increased by a whopping 92%. The Liberals' soft-on-crime policies mean that it's easier than ever for repeat violent offenders to get bail, and sentences are going down. Unfortunately, the best that this Liberal government can do is try and ban hunting rifles and shotguns, some that have been used for well over 100 years. This isn't about public safety. It's about dividing Canadians for political gain, and Canadians are taking notice. Just this past weekend, Montreal Canadiens goalie Carey Price took a stand against this Liberal government's brazen attempt to criminalize law-abiding hunters and sport shooters. I want to read some of his words into the record. Quote, "I love my country, and I care for my neighbor. I'm not a criminal or a threat to society. What this Prime Minister is doing is unjust," end quote. It's time for these Liberals to stop criminalizing hunters and go after the real criminals.
The Honourable Member for Outremont. This December 6th, we will once again commemorate the Polytechnique Massacre, which occurred 33 years ago. I will be, as I am every year, on the Mount Royal lookout in the company of the Prime Minister to pay tribute to the 14 women who were murdered simply because they were women. As I do every year, I will think of the innocent young girl that I was, and I'll think about how incomprehensible it is.
14 women using an assault-style automatic weapon, a weapon designed to kill as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time possible. Our government has proposed to take the next step in banning these weapons, but we are now in the midst of a disinformation campaign led by the gun lobby. We all agree that hunting is a long-standing tradition in this country, and we all want to protect that tradition. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't need an
oral questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Selon un nouveau rapport aujourd'hui,
According to a new report published today, the cost of food for the average family will increase by $1,000 next year to $16,300. It is not affordable for average families, and it's the result of this government's inflationary policies. 1 out of 5 Canadians is skipping meals because they cannot pay the grocery bill. When will this government stop with its inflationary policies so Canadians can put food on the table? The Honourable Minister of Tourism. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are not the only ones facing high food prices. We know this is a difficulty for Canadians. We also know that extreme weather conditions have led to poor harvests, and problems in the supply chain have made food prices go up. That is why we have a plan to double the GST credit, offer dental insurance, support rent payments. We are taking action. The Conservatives are voting against our measures. The Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
a farm with 5,000 acres, but an average farm, would pay $150,000 in carbon taxes that are already driving up the cost of food because they get passed on to the consumer. Food prices are expected to be up $1,000 for the average family to $16,000 a year to feed the average family, an incredible sum. In fact, the Mississauga Food Bank reports that some people have even said that the poverty is so grinding, they're asking for help with medical assistance in dying. We need to feed our people. Why doesn't the government reverse its inflationary policy so people can afford to eat and live?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we remain committed to supporting people get out of poverty. And in fact, we understand how difficult life is right now, which is why we have put forward numerous measures to help the most vulnerable Canadians. However, if the Leader of the Opposition is indeed sincere in his desire to help lift Canadians out of poverty, he would have voted for measures like the Canada Dental Benefit or the Canada Housing Benefit, or perhaps childcare, which right across the country fees are being reduced by 50%. But instead of doing that, he voted against it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, not only is Christmas dinner going to be especially expensive If you buy it at the grocery store, now the government wants to ban people in rural countrysides from actually hunting for their turkey. They've targeted a long list of hunting rifles and shotguns with a sweeping ban that's being widely condemned by experts, by hunters, and by First Nations people. Now, the government has admitted in recent testimony that the ban will apply to hunting rifles. Contrary to prior talking points, will they reverse this ban?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, before I come to the answer of that question, tomorrow we're marking the 33rd anniversary of the Polytechnic Institute shooting tragedy. To the families of the victims and to the survivors, we stand with you. We know that despite the passage of time, that the hurt and the loss never completely heals. We owe it to you and to all victims and all Canadians to end gun violence once and for all, Mr. Speaker, and I hope all members in this chamber will join me in a moment of solidarity. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, of course, we are all in solidarity in ending violence committed with guns. In fact, today we saw an example of the real problem. Police seized 62 firearms in Toronto. 57 of them came from the United States of America. Only one of them was from Ontario, and it was stolen over a year ago. The problem is not the hunter who in Wainwright, Alberta, or Happy Valley, Goose Bay in the East Coast is using his tools to feed his family. The problem is illegal guns coming across the border. Why won't they reinforce our border instead of attacking our hunters?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my Conservative colleague asks what's the government doing to reinforce our borders? Investing $450 million over the last 2 years alone, Mr. Speaker, to add more boots to the ground for the CBSA, to add more state-of-the-art technology for the CBSA, to allow them to build on the progress that they've made in seizing illegal guns at the border. And what did the Conservatives do at every moment where they had a chance to support those resources to the CBSA? They voted against.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The results of their policy is a 32% increase in violent crime, a massive 92% increase in gang murders. No matter how expensive their policies are, and no matter how much they target law-abiding hunters, it's not getting the job done to protect our people. Donc, pourquoi le gouvernement ne veut-il pas?
Why doesn't the government want to help when it comes to targeting real crime instead of targeting our hunters and farmers? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what our government is doing. We have already invested $450 million to strengthen our border to help the Border Services Agency. And that's exactly what we're doing with our legislation to increase penalties for criminals. Why won't the Conservatives support that bill if they want to target organized crime?
Honorable député de Salaberry-sur-Roi.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, COP15 on biodiversity will start on Friday, but a report has just revealed that 2,253 species are endangered in Canada. And meanwhile, in Newfoundland, the federal government is authorizing exploratory oil drilling in the high seas without an environmental assessment, right inside the right whale's habitat, which is an endangered species, along with 7 other types of whale, turtles, corals, birds, and more. Is that Canada's message at COP15, that biodiversity matters except when there's oil to be found? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I've said it before, and I want to be very clear. The Newfoundland Marine Protected Area will continue to remain protected, and we will continue to evaluate any exploration activities in the area on a case-by-case basis. There is currently a bid for tender, but no production activities have been authorized. The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, COP15 is starting in 2 days. But once again, the federal government is giving special treatment to oil companies. In 2020, Ottawa announced protected marine areas off Newfoundland. areas where fishing is restricted to protect biodiversity. But last month in that very area, they authorized 4 oil companies to carry out exploratory drilling without an environmental assessment. So, as far as I can see, fishing is forbidden to protect the seafloor, but drilling is okay. If that's not an example of special treatment for oil companies, I don't know what is. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, as I keep saying day after day, currently there is a bid for tender process with no production activities currently authorized in the offshore area. And I would like to emphasize that any proposal for production in these areas would be subject to the Environmental Impact Assessment Law. Currently, there are only exploratory activities.
For Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another 3 Indigenous women were murdered by an alleged serial killer in Winnipeg, and police aren't going to look for their remains, which they believe are in the Brady landfill. Imagine hearing that about your relative, Mr. Speaker. And while the government stalls in providing resources, Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit continue to be murdered because we are a target, Mr. Speaker. Will the government provide immediate funding to stop this genocide and the resources to search for the remains of our precious sisters?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and our hearts go out to the families of the victims. You know, it isn't on a day like this that we can sit here and pat ourselves on the back about what we've been doing as a government. Obviously, it has not been enough. It is very puzzling to hear the news that this landfill will not be searched. I spoke to the mayor of Winnipeg yesterday about this and hope to get some clear answers shortly. Clearly, the federal government needs to play a role in an area where jurisdiction is a poisonous word and continues to kill Indigenous women and children in this country.
Honourable member for Churchill-Kiwatinuk-Aski.
Mr. Speaker, Indigenous women targeted and murdered again by a serial killer. This is a nightmare, a killer with a chilling connection to neo-Nazism. This is happening here at home in Manitoba, and more women have gone missing since. There must be a comprehensive federal response now. Emergency shelters, economic supports, and real action on the dangerous rise of white supremacy. The families of Mercedes Marin, Morgan Harris, Rebecca Contois, and the 4th loved one deserve justice. Indigenous women and Indigenous communities deserve urgent action now from the federal government. When will the Liberals finally act?
The Honourable Minister for Crown and Indigenous Relations.
Mr. Speaker, extremism of the nature described by the member opposite is one of the biggest terrorist threats in this country, and it continues to prey on those that are most vulnerable, including Indigenous women, children and girls and LGBTQ folks across the country. We need a comprehensive federal response. We need a comprehensive provincial response. We need a comprehensive municipal response. It's why, in part, I've called for a federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous meeting in January to discuss the painful issue of MIWG and why we continue to fail as governments in making sure that everyone in this country is indeed safe. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
More bad news, Mr. Speaker. Families can expect to pay another $1,100 on their grocery bills on top of 40-year high food inflation, according to a recent report. Canadian families will be paying an average of $16,000 annually on their grocery bills next year. And the cause? Too many dollars chasing too few goods. Liberal inflation and the carbon tax have already driven up the cost on home heating, gas, and groceries, and they'll make it even worse when they triple their carbon tax. So why won't the Liberals stop forcing their failed inflationary carbon tax on cash-strapped Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, Canada and Canadians are not alone in facing high prices around the world. It's true that extreme weather has led to very bad harvests, and, Mr. Speaker, supply chain issues are still causing food prices to rise, which is why, Mr. Speaker, we have put in place supports to provide housing opportunities for Canadians, to double the GST tax credit, Mr. Speaker, also to put in place dental supports. And, Mr. Speaker, if the Conservatives are serious about getting some supports to Canadians, they can support the government and vote with the Fall Economic Statement C-32.
Well, member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Speaker, that minister from Alberta knows full well Albertans overwhelmingly rejected the Costly Coalition's carbon tax. The Albertans gave the provincial government a resounding mandate to scrap the NDP carbon tax that drove away jobs and that drove away our economy. And now they plan on tripling the carbon tax on gas, groceries, and home heating. Why won't that minister stand with Albertans, with Canadians, stand up against his leave-it-in-the-ground left Prime Minister, give Canadians a break so that they don't have to choose between eating and heating?
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, let me remind my honourable colleague from Calgary that the heat dome that caused people to die in my riding of Edmonton Centre, that the atmospheric river that drowned parts of British Columbia, that people in my riding in the middle of a pandemic, Mr. Speaker, did not say hurry up on the childcare, though they wanted that. They did not say give us more supports on COVID, though they wanted that. What did they say, Mr. Speaker? Fight climate change, make sure that we can have a future for our kids. The other side doesn't understand market economics. We do, and that's what's going to help Canadians and Albertans.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the NDP Liberals' record inflation means that Canadians can't afford to eat. Half of Canadians are already forced to cut back on healthy food. 1.5 million Canadians had to visit a food bank in a single month, and families will have to spend over $1,000 more on food next year. The Liberals' out-of-control spending and their ever-increasing carbon tax makes everything more expensive. So when will the Liberals give Canadians a break and stop forcing their failed carbon tax on struggling Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
Last Thursday, Mr. Speaker, I was in London, Ontario with the Prime Minister to announce the Canada Dental benefit was open for applications. I had the opportunity to actually talk with families about how important this is for them and for their children. $1,300 over 2 years, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that low-income kids go to the dentist. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have had opportunities to support vulnerable Canadians time and time again. They have voted against them each time. I hope we can count on their support with the fall economic statement so we can deliver that badly needed support to Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, most Canadians can hardly afford to make ends meet, and even the Bank of Canada governor says that this record inflation is a made-in-Canada problem caused by NDP Liberal out-of-control spending. Taxes, because of these Liberals, now cost Canadians 10% more than food, shelter, and clothing combined. Half of Canadians would go broke over a sudden $1,000 expense. But the NDP Liberals, they're going to take even more away. They're out of touch, and Canadians are out of money. So when will they axe their failed carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I think if we want to set the record straight and talk about which side of this House is actually putting more money in the pockets of Canadians, it's the government side, Mr. Speaker. That member and her colleagues just last week voted against tax cuts and tax breaks and supports directly to Canadians, Mr. Speaker. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, take a look at the remarks from Stephen Poloz, who said that our investments during the pandemic not only supported Canadians, they prevented and staved off a period of deflation. What is it that these Conservatives want, Mr. Speaker? More or less? That's not clear. We're going to support Canadians.
L'honorable député de Louis.
The honourable member for Louise Saint-Laurent. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's all very well to talk about inflation, but the reality is that Canadians are facing the worst inflation crisis in 40 years, which is hitting them hard and means that they can't even put food on the table. And what's even worse is that next year, things will be even worse. 4 Canadian universities have published a report stating that prices will go up by up to 10% next year. That's $1,100 more per family. That's a lot for people who are already struggling. Will this government commit to not increasing taxes during a period of inflation? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind my colleague that his party is not even capable of recognizing the reality of climate change. The impacts of the climate crisis are real, just as people who live in Gaspésie. This year we had Fiona, and past year we've had other huge storms. We need to act to protect our planet. We owe it to future generations. And one thing is clear. We shouldn't take lessons from climate skeptics. The Honourable Member for Louise Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, what my colleague just said is completely false. And I would invite her to apologize. Once again. After the odious things she said on Gaspésie Radio a few weeks ago. In any case, that's her business. But what is all Canadians' business is inflation. We are the only G7 countries that is increasing taxes during an inflationary period. This liberal Canada is doing that. Will this government, can this minister reply, will the government increase taxes next year, yes or no? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, even if we tripled the number of Conservative politicians who take the climate crisis seriously, that number would still be 0. But no need to worry, because on this side of the House we care about the planet, we care about our children and future generations. We will take action for Canadians, for the planet. And unlike the Conservatives, we're not going to spend our time complaining and not actually giving results. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, in 2017, the Prime Minister published a tweet inviting everyone fleeing persecution to come to Canada. But he probably didn't think that everyone would use Roxham Road to get here. But that's exactly what happened. In October alone, 3,900 asylum seekers came through Roxham Road for a total of more than 30,000 this year. And do you know how many people used regular checkpoints? Only 638 out of 30,000. Will the minister suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement so that asylum seekers once again start to use regular border checkpoints? The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Great respect to my honourable colleague. I expect he knows that people don't flee their country because of a tweet from a country's leader. They leave their country because they are fleeing violence, war, and persecution. We're going to continue to do what we can to support those who seek refuge in Canada and continue to do so in an organized way. I'm pleased to work with my colleagues on all sides of this House in order to treat those who are in search of safe haven with dignity and respect as we have an orderly migration system at the same time.
L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's tweet also surprised the RCMP, which didn't realize that 90% of its officers at the borders would now have to spend their time managing Roxham Road. There are 117 border checkpoints with Border Services officers where asylum seekers could cross the border instead of Roxham Road. If the minister suspended the agreement, that would enable the RCMP to do its work properly. When will the minister suspend the agreement so that the RCMP can concentrate on weapons trafficking instead? The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Does my colleague really think that people choose the rest of their lives based on a tweet? I've said it before. People crossing the border are people who have often experienced very difficult circumstances, men, women, and children who are fleeing violence and discrimination. My colleagues should consider the human side of things. The Bloc Québécois is asking for the agreement to be suspended, but Quebec is asking for it to be renegotiated. It's very confusing. My colleague should do his homework. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about dignity. Because of Roxham Road, 62% of asylum requests in Canada are made in Quebec. And the result is that we don't have enough space in our schools, immigration lawyers are overwhelmed, and so are community organizations. We need to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement to ensure that asylum seekers can be welcomed with dignity everywhere in Canada. Why should Montreal organizations have to do all the work instead of organizations in Vancouver, Winnipeg, or Halifax, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois is not interested in offering a dignified welcome to asylum seekers. It just wants to give them a locked door, whereas these men, women, and children are fleeing terrible circumstances. And the Bloc Québécois is all alone in its position. We are saying we need to renegotiate the agreement, and that's also what the Quebec government is saying. Everyone agrees on that. But the Bloc Québécois wants to suspend it. They're the only ones saying that. I wonder if they even know what they're talking about.
The Honourable Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the Indo-Pacific strategy says, with respect to Beijing, that the government will, quote, push back against any form of foreign interference on Canadian soil, end quote. It's time to put those words into action. Today, we learn about another 2 illegal police stations being operated by Beijing on Canadian soil, on top of the 3 we learned about last October. So when will the government put the words of the Indo-Pacific strategy into action, push back, and expel diplomats responsible for this outrageous violation of our sovereignty?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
I would have thought that my honourable colleague would have been assured by the concrete action that the RCMP is taking to root out allegations of foreign interference in this country as a means of protecting our national security. I would have thought that my honourable colleague would have been assured by the things that we are doing around allegations of foreign interference, creating independent panels to assure the integrity of our elections, cracking down on foreign fundings, and will continue to do whatever is necessary to protect our interests here and abroad. Thank you.
Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Speaker, was the Prime Minister briefed about Beijing's election interference involving 11 candidates? The Prime Minister has been repeatedly asked this question, and he hasn't answered it. He hides behind carefully crafted words such as saying he wasn't briefed about candidates receiving money from China. But that isn't the question. When will the Prime Minister stop his stonewalling, stop his word parsing, and tell us what he knows about Beijing's election interference?
The Honourable Minister for Interparliamentary Relations.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has been very transparent, as have all ministers in our government.
Absolutely.
Mr. Speaker, before the Conservatives were even interested in the real threat that foreign interference presents, our government took action. We took action in 2019. We renewed that action in 2021. We had a group of experts chaired by the Clerk of the Privy Council to examine these issues and assure Canadians that the election integrity was preserved. Mr. Speaker, we take this threat seriously and we're on the job.
Absolutely.
L'honorable député de Mégantic.
The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the same month that the Prime Minister was receiving a briefing on foreign interference in our elections, he decided not to do anything, and in that same month, MI5 publicly revealed the name of an agent of Beijing who had tried to influence UK politicians. Despite a directive from our National Intelligence Agency to make public this information, the Prime Minister prefers to hide behind a veil of secrecy, and he refuses to reply to our questions. So despite these briefings and serious allegations, no one has been arrested or publicly identified. Why? The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, as I've said on many occasions, and as the Minister of Public Safety and the Prime Minister have also said, we take the threat of foreign interference very seriously. We are working hard to protect our democratic institutions, which are so important in Canada. And good news, Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what our government has done. Despite all of the efforts of conspiracy theorists across the way, Mr. Speaker, I can assure you that Canadian elections were free and fair, and the results are completely trustworthy.
L'honorable député de Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie.
Monsieur le Président, au Québec.
Mr. Speaker, in Quebec, pediatric emergency rooms continue to overflow. Occupancy rates are as high as 150% in some hospitals. In pediatric care units, all overflow beds are full. The Centre Mère Enfant in Quebec City has been forced to postpone an exceptional number of surgeries. And among the children hospitalized are toddlers under the age of 2 with breathing problems. The situation is getting worse by the day. What are the Liberals doing to help care for our children? The Honourable Minister of Health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for that very relevant question. Indeed, our children are very ill these days, namely due to RSV, which is circulating very quickly and is causing serious damage to our families. Parents and grandparents, our health workers are having a great deal of difficulty. That's why we have to get vaccinated, take public health measures, and that's why the Canadian government must continue to support provinces and territories through these difficult times who are having a hard time looking after hospitals and care workers.
Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, sick kids in Alberta are waiting in heated trailers outside of hospitals. And now hospice care for children is paused as staff are redeployed to deal with the healthcare crisis. Mr. Speaker, families are forced to scramble for help during their last days with their children. Well, Danielle Smith is distracted by her ridiculous Sovereignty Act. Neither the federal or the provincial government are protecting the most vulnerable Albertan kids, and this is heartbreaking. When will this government stand up for families dealing with this healthcare crisis and get sick kids the care they deserve?
Before the health minister answers that, I just want to remind the honourable members that, like, talking across, it's nice to see people getting along and talking well together, but it gets in the way of question period. So I just want to remind them, if they really want to talk, maybe just take a couple of minutes, go outside, and then come back when you got everything settled. L'honorable député l'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister for Health.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague.
Of Canada, there have never been as many hospitalizations for children with the flu than ever in the history of Canada at the present time. So that means we have to take care of our children. Vaccination works. It's free for the flu and COVID-19 everywhere across Canada. Public health measures also matter and work. We, at the federal level, are going to continue to support provinces and territories with historical amounts of investment in support of their important work.
Yes. The honourable member for Scarborough Centre.
Mr. Speaker, for so many Canadians, finding housing that is affordable is becoming incredibly challenging. This is especially true in Scarborough and the entire city of Toronto. There is no question that we need to continue to do more. Can the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion please tell this House about the important progress our government is making to ensure that every Canadian has affordable housing that meets their needs?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question and her strong advocacy on housing in her community. We know how great the need for affordable housing is in various communities across the country, especially in the City of Toronto. That is why last week I was pleased to join the Mayor in announcing a federal investment of $90 million to build and renovate and repair and retrofit 750 homes for Indigenous peoples, women and children fleeing domestic violence, as well as refugee families. This is just one example of how our investments are making a real and tangible difference in the lives of Canadians, including in communities like Toronto.
Excellent. L'honorable député de Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord.
Monsieur le Président, depuis l'entrée au pouvoir.
Mr. Speaker, since the Liberals took office, violent crime has increased by 32%. Gang-related homicides increased by 92%. The Liberals aren't dealing with real problems. It's been some time that they've been unable to deal with illegal gun trafficking at the border. Instead of focusing on that, with Bloc support, the Liberals are targeting hundreds of thousands of hunters in Quebec who are practicing an ancient tradition. Why are they treating hunters like criminals? Why is the Liberal government not targeting real criminals once and for all? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. From the beginning, our government was clear that we're not targeting hunters. We're targeting criminal elements. We're targeting assault weapons used in the worst tragedies in our country. And in Bill C-21, we're targeting criminal elements with more severe penalties, with investments, and the Conservatives are the ones not supporting this bill. They should change their position. Thank you.
In St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals continue to deny that they're going after Canadian hunters with their latest gun ban, but the ban list is out, and hunters across the country have seen many of their commonly used firearms on that list. Hunters from Quebec, from Ontario, the Prairies, the North, our Indigenous hunters are all speaking out. Even legendary Montreal Canadian goalie Carey Price is speaking out, Mr. Speaker. And the CBC, in fact, just today said the list, quote, includes a number of long guns in wide use by Canadian farmers. So why won't the Liberals just admit that this was never about public safety, and it was their target all along to go after law-abiding hunters, sports shooters, and farmers, Mr. Speaker? This was their plan all along.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with great respect for my colleague, the intent of the government has always been clear. We are not targeting law-abiding gun owners or hunters. We are targeting the AR-15 style guns which have been used in some of the worst shooting tragedies in this country's history, including Politique. But recently, the Conservatives' friends at the Coalition for Firearms Rights exploited the worst femicide in Canadian history for profit. This was a slap in the face to all of the families of the victims and the survivors of Polytechnique. And I'm wondering, will the Conservatives Conservatives stand up now, condemn the CCFR, and ask them to apologize.
The honourable member for Fundy Royal.
Mr. Speaker, it seems the only person in this chamber that does not understand this bill is the minister himself. The bill lists in black and white the exact hunting rifles that the bill is banning. Constituents calling their members of parliament, both NDP and Liberal, they understand this bans hunting rifles. Carey Price, NHL goalie, understands it bans hunting rifles. The CBC, we know the Liberals read the CBC, they understand it bans hunting rifles. And we also know backbench Liberal MPs understand that this bill bans hunting rifles. You can't have it both ways. Either everyone else is wrong or the minister.
The honourable minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'll be the first person to stand up and applaud the exemplary work of our rural caucus who defend the rights of hunters and collectors and recreational sport shooters every day. And the Conservatives can mock, Mr. Speaker, but our side of the House knows full well.
Order. Order. The honourable minister. Do it from the top, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Speaker. And before I was rudely interrupted by the Conservatives, and am again, I was highlighting the incredible work of our rural caucus and indeed of all of our caucus who understand the importance of the traditions of hunting. And I've met with them and will continue to be sure that we are not targeting those hunting guns, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're working closely with the members of the committee who are undertaking a very careful study of the language of that bill to make sure it is in alignment with our intent, which is to go after those AR-15 style firearms which were used in the likes of the Polytechnique. We never want another one of those tragedies again. Thank you.
Member for Fundy Royal.
Mr. Speaker, the minister has it all wrong. Everything he just said is contradicted by the actual text of the bill. The text that we understand, that Liberal backbenchers understand, that their constituents understand, but just because he says it so does not make it so. Their entire philosophy and approach to crime is flawed, Mr. Speaker. The evidence is in. Since they took office, violent crime up 32%, gang-related homicides up 90%, wow. Yet their plan to combat these things is to go after law-abiding hunters. They need to get their priorities straight, go after the gangsters, leave hunters alone.
Hear, hear. The honourable minister for... The honourable minister.
And I am one of those hunters. Hear, hear. And I know I can speak for all the hunters in this room that we can't stand it when we see a firearm used, as we've heard earlier in Polytechnique, and take other innocent lives. Mr. Speaker, I would hope that we all want to work together to make this bill the best it can be. The terrible misuse of information that's out there has to stop, Mr. Speaker. I'm also going to tell you, I challenge anyone, please reach out with the specific make and model. The devil is in the details. The details of the weapons that are on that list are not
Honorable député de la Pointe de l'Île.
Président, statistique.
Mr. Speaker, Statistics Canada revealed the full decline of French in the workplace. Among the three worst sectors, we have banks, which are under federal jurisdiction. For 45 years, the federal government has allowed them to circumvent Bill 101. The result is that it's become a major contributor to the Anglicization of Quebec. Given all that, with Statistics Canada's figures in hand, why, in Bill C-13, are the Liberals still allowing banks to circumvent the Charter of the French language? The Honourable Minister for Official Languages. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, we recognize the decline of French throughout the country. We also recognize the statistics tabled this year after the census. That is why we're going to develop a bill that will do everything it can to protect this lovely language throughout the country. And we're going to work with official language minority communities. Employers and clients of private businesses under federal jurisdiction will be able to work and be served in French, and I hope that all the opposition and the Bloc will support us. The Honourable Member for La Pointe-de-l'Île. Mr. Speaker, Statistics Canada proved that by allowing businesses under federal jurisdiction, such as banks, to circumvent the Charter of the French language, Ottawa is contributing to the decline of French in the workplace. With C-13, it would continue this trend towards anglicization of workplaces in Quebec. As we speak, French is also declining as a language spoken at home. It's declining as a language of service in the Greater Montreal area and the Outaouais region. If on top of that, the federal government continues to encourage the decline of French at work with Bill C-13, what's the future of French in Quebec, in Canada? The Honourable Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would invite my colleague for La Pointe-de-l'Île to stop circulating false information about Bill C-13. Our government recognizes the decline of French, and that is why we're going forward with a bill that is ambitious. The federal government will do its fair share, will do everything it can to protect French throughout the country, including Quebec. And I hope that once again, all members of this House will work together, because stakeholders from coast to coast want this bill passed quickly, and there's a great deal of work left to be done. Thank you.
Hastings Lennox in Addington.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister has shown a serious disrespect to all Canadians. He seems to think that he can skirt the responsibility that comes with elected office by blaming global trends. Mr. Speaker, Canadians elected him to govern and help Canadians through record cost of everything, which he can do today by eliminating the carbon tax. Mr. Speaker, will this Prime Minister take leadership, assume some responsibility, and cancel the carbon tax? Yes or no?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And instead of fighting inflation and making life more affordable for Canadians, you know what the Conservatives want to do, Mr. Speaker? They want to make it harder for Canadians to save for their retirement. They want to make it harder for Canadians who lose their jobs. And instead of fighting climate change, Mr. Speaker, they want to make pollution free again on just about every measure that Canadians care about, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives are absent. We will always have Canadians' backs, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, Liberals don't have an environmental plan. It's a tax plan. Liberals have not met a single target that they have set. As is typical with this government, another non-answer. I ask for a yes or no, not more empty rhetoric. I'll provide the government with another opportunity to answer the simple question. Will they cancel the carbon tax? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague has made a suggestion that we haven't hit a target. The target that we have set is for 2030, so if she's got a DeLorean and a flux capacitor, I invite her to jump in and travel back in time. The reality is we are on track to reduce our emissions because of the investments that we're making. We are bringing pollution down, and we found a way to make it more affordable for families at the same time. Every step of the way, we will do what it takes to protect our environment for our kids and our grandkids, and to advance measures that support affordability at the same time. This is the path forward, Mr. Speaker. If the Conservatives don't join us on it, they'll enjoy sitting in opposition for a very long time.
The Honourable Member for Perth Wellington.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Canadians don't need a DeLorean to know how much of a failure this Liberal government has been when it comes to the environment. They haven't met a single target. They haven't planted a single tree. But, Mr. Speaker, what they have done is raise the costs on everyday Canadians. They're making it $1,400 more costly to buy groceries this year, another $1,100 per family next year. 1.5 million Canadians relied on a food bank in a single month. 500,000 of those were children. All of this is being driven up by the Liberal carbon tax. Will they do the right thing and remove the carbon tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, and as usual, the Conservatives are spreading misinformation. Mr. Speaker, we are on target to make our targets, and we will get there come hell or high water, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what is the Conservative record? They cut $350 million from the Environment and Climate Change budget, Mr. Speaker. They blew up Kyoto.
I just want to make sure you're done shouting. Okay. Very good. I don't know what it is, but I think they want to hear your answer over again. Right from the top, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I said before, emissions are going down. We're on track to make our targets. But the Conservative record, Mr. Speaker, is abysmal. You know what they did, Mr. Speaker? The first thing they did when they came to power was to cancel the National Child Care Program. But the second thing they did was to blow up the Kyoto Climate Accord. And, Mr. Speaker, they are now blaming us for their lack of action. Mr. Speaker, for their troubles, Mr. Speaker, they won the Fossil of the Day Award, they won the Fossil of the Year Award, and the Colossal Fossil Award, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Halifax West.
Monsieur le Président, les familles de Halifax West ont
Mr. Speaker, families in Halifax West welcome the news that our bilateral child care agreement would cut fees for the second time this year. That's an average cut of 50% in fees by 2022 for families with children in licensed daycare. In addition, our government has now established the National Advisory Council on Early Learning and Childcare. This will benefit from the expertise of Dr. Christine McLean from my riding. Can the Minister for Families, Children and Social Development inform the Honourable Minister of Families? Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. By reducing high childcare fees and reducing long wait times, and so we are pleased to have announced that the Government of Canada will reduce licensed daycare fees for families in Nova Scotia by an average of 50%. This is a great step forward for regulated, or rather licensed daycare services for families in Nova Scotia. With our provinces, with our partners in the provinces, we'll continue to make things better for all children in Canada.
Canadians face the worst affordability crisis in a generation, yet this government is only making things worse. $54 million on the ArriveCan fiasco, $6,000 a night for the Prime Minister's luxury suite in London, $1 billion in wage subsidies to wealthy corporations. Liberal waste has become a national embarrassment. And every time this government borrows and spends on waste, life becomes more unaffordable for Canadians. Will this government finally put an end to this inflationary spending? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
The Conservatives have demonstrated time and time again that when it comes to supporting Canadians, they vote against them. They voted against early learning and childcare, which fees are reducing by 50% from coast to coast to coast across the country. That's thousands of dollars in the pockets of Canadian families. They voted against the Canada Dental benefit up to $1,300 over 2 years for children to get their teeth cleaned. They voted against the Canada Housing benefit, $500 to help low-income renters. Mr. Speaker, will they stop at nothing to not help low-income Canadians? Mr. Speaker, we will continue to...
L'honorable député de Charbot-Haute-Saint-Charles.
Mr. Speaker, in January 2017, the Prime Minister invited all those fleeing persecution and war to come to Canada, but instead of prioritizing real refugees, he rolled out the red carpet for those who were visiting or already residing in the U.S. In 2017, it's possible that people were fleeing the United States because of Donald Trump, but that fear doesn't exist under the Biden administration. When will he come to the aid of real refugees and permanently close Roxham Road? The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Mr. Speaker, we're taking note of the little knowledge the Conservatives are displaying about Roxham. We're talking about men, women, and children who have fled tragic situations. I think that the Conservative Party should inform itself a bit better before trying to ask questions on the subject. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, I think I'm well aware of the file, and I'm aware that the United States is a safe country. People in the United States can ask asylum in the United States if they need asylum. When they go from the U.S. to Canada, we're not respecting the Safe Third Country Agreement. Can the government resolve the issue with the Safe Third Country agreement and stop people from coming in through land crossing. The Honourable Minister for Immigration.
Domestic and legal and international legal obligations that require us to consider in good faith claims of asylum that have been made for those who enter the country in search of safe haven. In his previous question, he indicated that people are somehow displacing other more deserving refugees. I would point out, Mr. Speaker, to my honourable colleague that Canada over the past 3 years has resettled more refugees than any other country in the world. And each of the last 2 years, Canada has resettled more than 1/3 of the total number of refugees that have been settled anywhere globally. We will continue to be the world leader when it comes to doing the right thing to support the world's vulnerable, not just who cross our border from the United States, but around the world altogether.
Well, member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada's air sector helps keep Canadians connected with their loved ones from coast to coast to coast across our vast and beautiful country. After 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's more important than ever that we support our air sector, especially as we head into the busy winter travel season. Can the Minister of Transport provide an update on recent actions our government is taking to strengthen our air industry ahead of the holidays? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my honourable colleague for his leadership and advocacy. Over the last couple of years, the air sector has suffered a lot. Its workers, its customers have gone through an extraordinary period of time. Last week, I hosted a summit that invited more than 50 leaders of the industry, including CEOs of airlines and airports. We agreed we need to work together on lessons learned from the last couple of years. We agreed to focus on how we can improve efficiency, transparency, and accountability. We are committed to improving the air sector, Mr. Speaker. We want to make sure that Canadians have a competitive, safe, and efficient sector so they can travel with great experience. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Elmwood to Transcona.
Mr. Speaker, it's no secret around here that Canadian households are already strapped in a period of incredible inflation, and today we learned that food prices for next year are projected to go up by another $1,000 a year for the groceries of an average family of 4. And often when the government answers questions about that, they like to get up and talk about things the NDP made them do: the dental benefit, the doubling of the GST rebate, the rental benefit. But the fact is, in the face of prices that continue to go up, they need to do more. We want a windfall tax, and we want the elimination of GST on home eating. When are they going to get up and talk about that?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, what I want to talk about today is the fact that Canada is not alone in facing high food prices. We have drought, we have failed crops, we have supply chain issues that are causing prices of food to rise around the world. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we have supports in place to help Canadians. But, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Industry himself has reached out to the Commissioner of the Competition Bureau to make sure that food companies are respecting all the protections in place for consumers. That's real action. That's what we're doing, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable député de Richmond-Arthabasca.
Monsieur le Président, jeudi.
Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, Pastor Claude Guillot was found guilty of 18 charges for serious acts committed against children. In his defense, he used Section 43 of the Criminal Code, which states every schoolteacher, parent, or person standing in the place of a parent is justified in using force by way of correction towards a pupil or child, as the case may be. 64 countries have already banned corporal punishment and 27 more in the process of doing so. Can the Prime Minister or the Minister of Justice confirm that Canada will repeal Section 43 to protect our children? The Honourable Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada recognizes that all children have the right to be protected from violence. Assault is defined broadly in Canada's code, including using a force against a person regardless of their age. That can include non-consensual acts that involve harm or physical harm. The use of physical discipline on children is discouraged. We have a bill before us, and we will make the decision when the time comes. Time.
This first, and then we'll come out. I have something here that I think would have precedence. So I'll come to the honourable member after first point of order. I believe that following discussions among representatives of all parties in the House, I understand that there is an agreement to observe a moment of silence in memory of the recently murdered Indigenous women in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
I now invite honourable members to rise.
Merci.
And the Honourable Opposition House Leader is rising on a point of order.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister for Rural Economic Development invited any member or any Canadian who had information